This afternoon's lecture is by Patton, and it's Poussin's Arcadian vision, Search for the Golden Age. Following the discovery of a unique geometry at the heart of the substructure of his masterpiece, The Shepherds of Arcadia, research revealed that the 17th century French artist Nicolas Poussin was closely affiliated to a European-wide network of enlightened intellectuals, of which the English statesman Sir Francis Bacon was a major figure. Bacon is considered to have had a significant influence on the development of what can be termed Rosicrucian philosophy, shared by many of his intellectual peers. Despite some variations in approach and belief, they shared in a noble but at the time heretical quest, typified by Bacon's utopian vision presented in his book New Atlantis. This was nothing less than the restoration of the mythical Golden Age through scientific discovery, personal spiritual enlightenment, and social reform. Detailed research suggests that Poussin, well known to these intellectual circles, shared this vision and attempted to provide visual support and a means of covert, sophisticated communication through his art. Patton, a former teacher of mathematics, has always had a particular fascination for geometry and numerical relationships. An interest in history, architecture, psychology, and religions led to his reading of the Holy Blood and Holy Grail and the Messianic legacy. Intrigued, but not entirely convinced by their allegations and revelations, he undertook his own research and published his findings in Web of Gold 2000 and Masters of Deception 2009. His latest work, involving a detailed study of Nicolas Poussin and his painting The Arcadian Shepherds, arose from one of these controversial allegations. His discoveries and unique conclusions are presented in Poussin's Arcadian vision, Search for the Golden Age, 2014.
Thank you very much. Good afternoon, everybody. And first of all, thank you very much for inviting me to the Society. I'm very aware that you probably have got a great deal more knowledge than I have of Sir Francis Bacon, I have to say regretfully, because he is a piece, a significant piece, but just a piece in a much bigger jigsaw, which I've been researching now for quite a long time. And this talk really is to show how he fits into this wider picture in a fascinating way. And there's loads more research to be done in my view. I'm also not particularly good at remembering facts and figures, and I tend to leave chunks of what's important out if I don't refer to some notes. So please forgive me if I refer to my notes. As was said in that fantastic introduction, thank you very much, the focus of this talk arises from the surprising discovery of a unique geometry in the substructure of Nicolas Poussin's masterpiece, Les Berges d'Arcadie. To explain this finding, I undertook a detailed study of the life and times of the artist. In the course of this investigation, it became apparent that Poussin had connections and was influenced by some of the most eminent philosophers and scientists in Europe, many of whose ideas were founded on the work of the great English statesman Sir Francis Bacon. In this short talk, it is only possible to give a glimpse of what proved to be a far-reaching study with many fascinating threads of each of which could warrant an investigation of their own. Even my book is not detailed to the point of a lot of academic studies, because I wanted to give an overview with lots of hints and threads that individuals could then take up for themselves if they're interested in, because not everyone is interested in every single thread, because different threads move off in quite different directions. I'm not a historian or even an art historian, as was said. I was a teacher, amongst other things, of mathematics. But I became aware of the Poussin connection, and this is Nicolas Poussin, through an interest in the so-called mystery of Rosicrucianism. I say the so-called mystery because when I read the Holy Blood and the Holy Grail and the associated works at the time, like most people, I was sort of, to some extent, taken in, fascinated, not entirely convinced, but I thought there's a lot there. After over 25 years of research, and my colleague John Bolt has shared that investigative path with me, we've managed to show that probably 90% of it is actually a very good story, but not much basis in fact. But however, within that, the people who constructed this story over a period of time did access a lot of actual factual information. So there is a basis of fact, and what we've tried to do is look at what the facts are and then discard the fiction and see where that leads us. A key part of the hypothesis put forward in the Holy Blood and the Holy Grail, which was written in 1982 by Michael Bagent, Richard Lee and Henry Lincoln, was the role of Poussin. And he was born in Les Andelys, north of Paris on the Seine, and that's in the park near where he was born. There's a statue of him, rather fine statue. The role of Poussin and his masterpiece, The Shepherds of Arcadia, which we can see here, which is in the Louvre. It was alleged that Poussin was in possession of a great but undefined secret, a clue to which he'd encoded with geometry in the painting. And a lot of the work in the Holy Blood and Holy Grail and Henry Lincoln's later book was actually looking at this painting and see if they could find what this secret was, and most people assumed it to be some sort of treasure, and so the quest has been looking for where's the gold. There isn't any, unfortunately. If there was, I wouldn't be standing here. I'd be on a tax haven somewhere. Anyway, Henry Lincoln. I should mention that across the centre of the tomb here, which you can't see very well, is this phrase "et in Arcadia ego," which is actually quite a crucial part of it. And the Arcadia bit is obvious. Et in Arcadia ego is very simple Latin, and in Arcadia I. And that's really part of the whole philosophy. We'll get into that a bit later on. So Henry Lincoln, in attempting to find out if there was anything hidden, and he asked Professor Cornford of the College of Art, Royal College of Art, if he'd look at it and see if there was any geometry. And this is what Professor Cornford came up with, which all looks very good. It sort of fits to a point. But I wasn't very convinced. And the reason I wasn't very convinced is, first of all, the actual dimensions of the canvas seem to indicate how the geometry works. Now, I know that canvases are restretched over time, and so whatever they were to start with, they often aren't by the end of it. So whatever dimensions he took there, I don't know which ones he took, but there was never a set dimension for the painting. That's the first thing. And if you move that the top up a bit or this side out a bit, it wouldn't work. So that's the first thing that struck me. It was then found, when they took it out for painting, that there was about 2 centimetres running across the top, which had been covered by the frame. So in fact, the picture is actually even larger than Cornford realised at the time. So that devalued it. Secondly, the geometry itself doesn't seem to link up very well with any of the features in the painting. So the shepherds and the shepherdess and the tomb, there's no identified features which all connect. And I thought, well, that's strange. Why paint something and then put a geometry which doesn't actually relate to the composition? And then finally, trying to understand, which is a bit difficult, the mind of a 17th century French painter. If you had a secret you wanted to encode in the painting, would you choose that method, which again relies on the frame, so it could be changed at any time by anybody, and it doesn't actually link to anything? And what does it mean anyway? So with that in mind, I thought, well, I don't buy that one. But there have been many other attempts at geometry, some quite fanciful, some quite interesting, but none of them I found convincing, and I could show you lots of them, but I'm not going to now. But this painting has achieved a certain celebrity status over the centuries. It has been it's been fascinating to a lot of people, art historians and other painters, for whatever reason, maybe just the expertise of the painting itself, but often the philosophical content. It was believed to have contained a philosophical message. So I thought, well, let's see if we can look into this. And so this is the journey I went on in trying to see if there was anything in the painting. So I undertook this examination of the painting with no preconceived ideas. I thought, I'm not going to think of what it might mean or anything, just look at the painting and see what comes out of it as a mathematician, and concentrating solely on the major features. And I think you'll agree with me that there are several major features. Obviously the background is sort of the mountainous, wooded background associated with Arcadia. We'll get into that in a minute, why that is. There's a big block of a tomb there in the middle, that's fine. We've got two figures this side, two figures that side. We've got staves, which are obviously clearly defined lines, which create angles. And the whole group looks to me as if it's in a circle. Everyone's leaning in for obvious reasons, but it looks, there's a sort of circularity to the whole thing. So I thought, well, let's look, first of all, that's the circle, and those are the staves. So I thought, well, I wonder if the staves and the circle are linked, because I love Euclidean geometry, it's all about angles and segments and all that sort of thing. And so I thought, well, what happens if we extend the staves downwards and they come to a point down here? And then I thought, well, okay, that's fine. But if there's going to be a circle here somewhere, I need to know where the centre is. Well, the obvious thing to do is bisect the angle of the staves, which runs right down the middle of the painting, which seems to separate them into two distinct halves. So that seems to me, and it goes right through the centre of a mountain. That looks as if it's sort of deliberate to my mind. Then I thought, well, to find the centre, which must lie on there, if that's the diameter, we've got to find another line. So I thought, well, where's the only other line of symmetry in the two sets of figures? And it's this line here, which goes in front of their toes and in front of their hair. Now, bearing in mind that this is, if you see the full-size thing, it's quite a big painting, and painters aren't going to measure every millimetre. I think that's pretty close, personally. So I then assumed that was the centre, which is very interesting because it falls right in the middle of the circular shadow caused by the shepherd's head. And I thought, well, again, that all seems to fit in the way the composition's developing. So I drew the circle, going through that point there, with the centre there, and guess what? It went through exactly that point there. Okay, I didn't make that up. It just went. So I thought, I think I must be doing something right here. Okay, and it sort of fits the figure. It fits the whole composition. So I thought, well, where do we go now? Now, in the back of my mind, I'm sort of thinking pentagons, because everyone's talking about pentagons. And I thought, well, that doesn't look like a pentagon angle to me, but let's have a look and see. And the angle at the top is exactly 1/7 of a circle. And this is drawn by a computer. Okay, so that shows how accurate it is. It's very accurate, which means, having drawn that chord in, you put in the rest, and you've got a heptagon. Now I'm thinking, my goodness me, now what? Now, the fascinating thing is, when I look at the heptagon, the angles of the side of the figure mirror the figures. You can see the slope of the shoulders of the shepherdess, straight down the back, leg, back. It all fits, doesn't it? Are you convinced? Okay. Now, I've not imposed the geometry on the painting, which is what most people have done. What I've done is I've looked at the painting and see what comes out of it. Now, I thought, well, just to check myself, I got a blank piece of paper, I drew a circle, I put in the heptagon with the staves, and it was very easy then to construct the figures. So it's not a leap of faith to say he might have drawn that first. We would have drawn it with charcoal or something, and then painted to fit within it. So I found a couple of other things that just sort of add it a little bit more. First of all, this centre circle here, which tends to fit in with the top of the bottom of the tomb there, the front of the shepherdess, and the fold of his robe and so on. That's exactly half the other circle, exactly half. And then this figure here, I'm sure you're familiar, is called a vesica piscis, and that confers divinity, which means that this figure, in Poussin's mind, is not just a shepherdess, it's something greater than the shepherdess. Interestingly enough, before my findings, people have been talking about her as wisdom, a divinity representing wisdom, whether it's the goddess Athena, Diana, or any of these figures. And the whole explanation for the painting seems to be the shepherds are very, very simple folk, come across a tomb with this Latin inscription, Et in Arcadia Riga, thinking, what's that all about? And she is standing there full of knowledge and wisdom, saying, well, it's obvious. And that's what other people have been saying about it. And this seems to confer a sort of added strength to that view, with the geometry, with the seven-sided figure, and the inference that this is a divine figure. Okay, let's get back to... excuse me while I just get these out of the way and move on. Okay, so the next thing is, well, how do we explain this geometry? It's all very well having found it, but how do we explain a seven-sided figure and the Arcadian theme? Is there any link between the two? So, first of all, number 7. Now, we're talking about the 17th century. Mythology, religion, science, mathematics, and art were once part of an integrated system of philosophy. Plato considered number and geometry as the ideal means of communication and communicating philosophical thought. St. Augustine of Hippo, 354-430 CE, wrote, "Numbers are the universal language offered by the deity to humans as confirmation of the truth." We were almost hearing Bacon's words when and this was written in the time of ancient Greek. He argued that the human mind apprehends universal, objective, unchanging and essential truths that are superior to the human mind itself. Now, we're going to find a bit later on in my talk how this is so important. And you said what made Bacon so different? Well, he understood these things. Okay? Since truth must reside in the mind, Augustine argued that these eternal truths are grounded in the eternal mind of God. In the 17th century, numbers fulfilled a symbolic function which did not arise from arithmetic, but from a metaphysical form of mathematics used to describe the structure and function of the cosmos. Numbers and symbols form virtual languages, only to be understood by the educated elite. And as we said a bit earlier, that only a relatively small people were educated enough to actually understand all of this, and the majority of people wouldn't know what you're talking about. Numbers and symbols form virtual languages, at first created in the worlds of magic, alchemy and Kabbalah. Many of the same symbols were later adopted by the scientific community and still are today. You find a lot of the symbols we use in physics and chemistry and astronomy hark right back to ancient alchemical symbols. So they have become a universal language in that field. In Poussin's time, the lines separating scientific discovery and metaphysics were blurred, and numbers still possessed powerful symbolic functions. And what we must remember is that science, as was said earlier, wasn't seen as subjects that were studied at GCSE, chemistry, physics, and put in little boxes. Science was an understanding of the world. Science was knowledge. It didn't mean individual little bits of information packaged up in a GCSE paper, which is what, sadly, it's become today. And because now our scientific advancement is so huge, and we have to now sort of microscopically examine tiny fragments of science, whether it's quantum physics or the sort of biomechanics or some of the most incredible science now we've got in sort of computer studies, how graphene works at atomic level. It's just mind-boggling for the rest of us. But it's so divorced from everything else that all these people working in isolation aren't part of a philosophical whole, which the people in these days, they saw themselves that this was trying to understand the world around them. Now this just gives you an example. This is from Sir Isaac Newton's book, who came a little bit later, and this comes from Robert Flood's book, which is a little bit earlier, and they're showing you there how geometry is used symbolically to express ideas. I'm not going to go into it because it's too detailed. This is not a very good illustration, but you can see it's coming out of his skull. There are actually 7 little spheres. There are 7 spheres. The 7 seems to be, this is just 2 examples of many. 7 at that time, in the 17th century, was a very powerful figure, a very powerful concept. Number in the form of geometry. This is alchemy and geometry. Number in the form of geometry and ratio was particularly significant, most famous of which is the pentagon and its derivative, the golden mean. Is everyone familiar with the golden mean? Oh, the golden mean is a ratio, it's 1 to 1.618. It's derived from the geometry of a pentagon. The interesting thing about the golden mean is that the reciprocal of the golden mean, that's 1 over 1.1618, is 0.618. If you square it, 1.618, it becomes 2.618. And it's got loads of other very, very interesting, fascinating properties, if you like, mathematics. But more than that, if you were to design a house and the width was 1.618 and the height was 1, it would be very pleasing. And you think, that reminds me of something, and it would, because most Greek temples were designed on that. And from the Greek temples, we get the Palladian houses of Georgian England, and that's a lot of their beauty is the fact that that particular relationship is used a lot. There are other relationships, but geometry was considered very important in aesthetics. There was also the hexagon, which is formed from 2 interlocking triangles, which symbolised the union of the macrocosm, that's the world above, and the microcosm of the world below. And Robert Flood, who I mentioned, he was an exponent of this sort of magical as above, so below. 7 has an abiding significance in cultures everywhere. For example, there are the 7 days of the week, 7 colours of the rainbow, 7 notes of the musical scale, 7 metals of ancient alchemy, 7 planets of ancient astronomy, because they only knew of 7. There were the 7 muses: history, poetry, comedy, tragedy, music, dance, and astronomy. The 7 medieval arts, also called the 7 liberal arts, which was grammar, rhetoric, logic, music, arithmetic, geometry, and astronomy. You see how important the mathematical side of things was in a philosophical sense. they formed the basis of a classical education. So people like Bacon would have been brought up with this backcloth of knowledge, as opposed to the sort of knowledge that we have in schools today, which is completely different. So it's quite interesting, just as an aside, when one is researching in a period not of your own, you really do have to try, it's very, very difficult, to forget how educated you are and what you know, and try and think how they would have thought and what they didn't know, and how, as you said, things at the time were fascinating to them because it was new. And they were able to show it with other people who would say, wow, whereas today we've got so blasé about it, people come up with something extraordinary and say, oh yeah, that's quite nice, isn't it? You know, what's for tea? You know, so sadly we have got rather, you know, underwhelmed, haven't we, by what really we ought to be fascinated by, you know, and that's the planet. That's another story though. The number 7 also appears in the realms of mystery and spirituality. The Bible has thousands of references to 7. William Shakespeare refers to the 7 ages of man. And what's quite interesting is that he wrote sonnets. And sonnets are composed of 2 groups of 7 lines, 14 lines. But how many sonnets did he write? He wrote 154. 2 times 7, 7. Now, it might be complete coincidence, but it just seems to me, if we're talking about symbolism and the number 7, isn't that interesting that of all the numbers he would choose, they're the ones that come up. According to the Jewish Alexandrian philosopher Philo Judaeus, in 10 BCE to 45 CE, nature delights in the number 7. So this is very ancient. It goes back way back before the 17th century. The number 7, a compound of 3 and 4, is the factor element in every ancient religion. Because it is the factor element in nature, in short, the number 7 has become the symbol for the universe. And I've really paraphrased masses of work. If you look into it, you'll find that there's massive work saying that the number 7 has a very powerful symbolic significance, and hence my view is that's why Poussin, unlike the majority of artists who would never use the number 7 because it's very difficult to create an accurate 7-sided figure, because the number in the middle is something like 51.457, something ridiculous, whereas you can create triangles, octagons, 8-sided figures easily, hexagons and so on. You can do them with a compass and a set square. Finally, Sir Anthony Blunt's assessment of the importance of geometry to Poussin, and Sir Anthony Blunt, for all his failings, and we all know about him, he was the world's expert on Poussin, is unequivocal. He says, and I just sort of take some quotes out, Poussin's conception of reason was closely bound up with mathematics and especially geometry. The idea of connecting painting and mathematics was not, of course, new. It had been one of the foundations of Renaissance aesthetics. But Poussin believed in it with such fervour that it produced new and astonishing results in the paintings of the 1640s, which is when the Shepherds of Arcadia was painted. So back then, before he saw my geometry, or even this was written before any of the later works looking at Poussin in a slightly different work, he identified that there's something special in his painting and his use of geometry. So that's the number 7, and to some extent I've just given you an overview of why the 7's important in the painting. The next aspect is the Arcadian theme, because it is the Shepherds of Arcadia. There's a geographical reality to Arcadia, and that is it's an area of central Greece, and it's a wild mountainous area, and I've never actually visited, but pictures I see, it's quite wild and it's got sort of savage beauty, I suppose is how you'd call it. It's quite remote. And this became the backcloth for the mythology of Pan and Arcadia as the ideal land with shepherds and shepherdesses living in perfect harmony. And you've got Virgil and other poets referring to this land as being an ideal land where, strangely, it's contradictory because Pan was an awful person But he seemed to go around playing these pipes of Pan, the seven reeded pipes, and chanting everyone with his music. He was somewhat lecherous, but they all seemed to let him get away with it. I think it wouldn't stand scrutiny today, would it? So by the 16th and 17th centuries, this had become a symbol for a lost golden age, an expression of the ideal society, also very closely associated with the Garden of Eden before the fall, when everybody apparently lived happily and the concept of sin and so on didn't exist. And we must remember, in Bacon's time, we were having this little discussion about religion. I think they were more, these intellectuals were less dogmatic when it came to the role of Jesus Christ and so on. I think they were more into God, and they were God-fearing. And this whole idea of an overarching deity whose mind had conceived the planet and the people. And I think that is more important to them than actually, and in fact I tend to think most of them would have torn their hair out at all this goings on between the Pope and Henry VIII and then the Lutherans and the party, because it's all about control. But they weren't interested in control, they were interested in knowledge. And that knowledge was God, and it was the same God, whichever one you went for. And I think they just had to be practical as to who was going to support them and who wasn't going to persecute them. And the interesting thing about Europe in that time is it was divided in half. Where Poussin was, in Rome, it was Catholic, and people like Giordano Bruno, the friar, the scientific chap, and Galileo suffered horrendously. They're just two. Whereas in Northern Europe, in Britain and the Netherlands and Bohemia and these places, it was Protestant, more free-thinking, and people could have ideas. And so it was quite interesting to see how the people were communicating from the Catholic areas, where they had to be really careful, with the Protestant areas, where you could be a little more freer. And it's quite interesting that Bacon actually was stayed in contact with Elizabeth Stuart after the disaster in Bohemia, when her husband he finally died, but he was beaten at the Battle of the White Mountain, I think, in 1620. He before set up this court at Heidelberg, and we'll see that that was very much part of the whole Rosicrucian movement and free thinking. Need to move on here. Poets, playwrights, philosophers produced works on this Arcadian theme, and I talk about the 16th, 17th century, and their concepts of utopia. Sir Philip Sidney wrote The Countess of Pembroke's Arcadia. Sir Philip Sidney was a friend of Bacon's. I read somewhere they were cousins, but I can't quite see that, because if you look at the family tree, it doesn't work. But you have to be very careful when you do research, because people say all sorts of things, and they often repeat it because they've read it somewhere else, because they never checked it. But certainly he was very well known, Sir Philip Sidney at the time, and this was published in 1590, and just show you what he looked like. That's him there. He died quite young, actually. There is some mystery and debate over the original authorship. There are people who claim that it was actually Sir Francis Bacon, who you well know. I'm sure you've seen that many times. But there's no evidence one way or the other. But the important thing is that there was this Arcadian theme had started back in the 1500s, mid-1500s, in fact. Revised editions appeared in 1593 and 1621. The poem was an idealised and nostalgic view of pastoral life reaching back to the age of mythology, in brief. That's what it was about. Sidney and Bacon had strong family connections through the two great families of the time. That's the Dudleys and the Cecils. I'm sure you probably know more about the patronage and Bacon's father being at court and so on and so on. So I don't need to really go into that. It was a very small world, and these people all knew each other and supported each other. Bacon himself, as we well know, wrote a number of very influential works, culminating in his own utopian view presented in New Atlantis. And that's a title page of New Atlantis, which was published posthumously in 1627. And I won't go into all the detail of it because I'm sure most of you have read it and certainly read about it. But it's his view of how society should advance in terms of spirituality, scientific discovery, and how society should be structured and so on. There were quite a few other utopian works at the time by different authors, many of whom will be involved in the networks we're talking about. It is evidence that his influence continued long after his death in the philosophical and scientific thinking of many of Europe's greatest intellects throughout the 17th century. On the theme of an English Arcadia, a quote from Bacon's Wisdom of the Ancients describes it thus: "The ancients described nature under the person of Pan. Pan represents and lays open the all of things of nature." So he's immediately connecting us back to Arcadia. So he knew what was going on and shared it with all the others. Bacon accepted the link between Arcadia and the secrets of nature. Interestingly, Bacon wrote of time bringing forth hidden truth. And I see, you just handed me one here, which is, yeah, it says here, doesn't it? Where are we? It's a title of, if you've read this one recently, it's the title of one of the, yes, Time Brings Forth the Hidden Truth. So that's quite a coincidence. Yeah, he wrote the title page of the second edition contains this woodcut. The interesting thing is, this is the second edition of New Atlantis. It contains a woodcut of time-saving truth, a theme that Poussin was to embrace on at least 2 occasions with many other similar philosophical subjects. So they're on the same sort of wavelength. Back to Nicolas Poussin. Poussin took up residence in Rome in 1625. Despite establishing a status as a master painter, he also gained a reputation as a Stoic philosopher painter. Much of what we know of him and his thinking on various subjects has been revealed through the abundant correspondence from him and to him and by third parties about him. So there's quite a lot of actual first-hand material to know what he thought about different subjects. His most influential contact in Rome was Cassiano del Pozzo, secretary to Maffeo Barberini, cardinal and later pope. Cassiano became a great friend, mentor and patron and allowed Poussin access to the great libraries of the Barberini and contacts with many other great intellectuals of the time. Cassiano del Pozzo was secretary to the Academy of Linces, the Accademia dei Lincei, of which Galileo was a principal member. And their purpose was to study and catalogue through drawing the wonders of nature, be it archaeological remains or natural history. And there exists today the Paper Museum, it's called, I forget the Latin name. Part of it's in British Library, some of it's in Windsor Castle, which got the most fantastic drawings done by a whole collection of artists that Cassiano del Pozzo got around him, and I'm sure included Poussin, to record the natural world. Cassiano del Pozzo was a respected figure amongst the intellectual circles and academies in Europe, and having read his works being Bacon's works, having read Bacon's works, he suggested that Francis Bacon could have been an ideal and valuable member of the Linces Academy if he'd lived in Rome. So Bacon's works and thoughts were spreading out into Europe, and that is a clear indication that how respected he was in a very respected academy of the time, the Linces, which is about trying to catalogue and understand nature. The major legacy of the Academy was it's a Museo Cartaceo, collection of intricate drawings of archaeological remains in the natural world. In a dinner party held in 1642, held in honour of Cassiano, this is in Paris in 1642, there's a letter which refers to Poussin's direct contact at that party with some prominent intellectuals at the time, three of which actually, the Abbé Bourdelot, who had his own academies and surrounded himself by scientists and philosophers, Gabriel Naudé, who was very prominent in the Rosicrucian movement, and was also a member of other academies, and Guy Patton, who was a medical doctor, and again interested in Paracelsian science of medicine and so on. So these are people he's actually sitting down having dinner with. So we're not speculating, we know amongst others, he knew some quite prominent people. Further investigation of Poussin's circles reveal a connection to Queen Christina of Sweden. I could spend a whole hour talking about her. She's fascinating. She was considered to be one of the most learned women of her time. She moved from Sweden in 1654 to live in Rome. And she surrounded herself with the cream of artists, poets, sculptors, architects, scientists, philosophers, and alchemists. And there's abundant information on her and the people she met, and she paid. She paid René Descartes, who was a founder of Cartesian geometry, very famous mathematician and philosopher. He paid for him to come and talk philosophy with her. So she had that sort of influence. An Arcadian Academy was founded in her name in 1689, and that's just after she died, whose symbol was the seven-reeded panpipe. So that's a throwback to the whole Arcadian theme. The writings and correspondence of many of these great intellectuals reveal common bonds. Oh, I missed out a couple of these. Oh, that's the Academy, the link is. This actually is a list or some of the interconnections of these intellectuals, which if I really don't have time to go into detail who they are, but once you know who these people are and you see how they're interconnected themselves, at the time there are all these academies taking place in France, and the same names just keep cropping up all the time. And we are talking about some of the greatest intellects, and we still talk about Leibniz and Robert Boyle, Sir Isaac Newton, René Descartes, Blaise Pascal. They are still household names if you study geometry or physics or chemistry and so on, not to mention the philosophers amongst them as well. And these are just a handful of people that attended these different academies. And we can see from the dinner party that Poussin was involved with people who were directly involved with all the others. Now, that's not a smoking gun as such, but it's pretty obvious he knew what was going on and he was involved in these circles. The writings and correspondence of many of these great intellectuals reveal common threads with strong links to a phenomenon that first became public in 1614, and that's Rosicrucianism. And that is just a Rosicrucian drawing. I say Rosicrucian, what I'm saying is it's in a book which was written and published by people who are known to support Rosicrucianism, and it very much typifies in a visual sense what one of the manifestos talks about, the seven-sided tomb. You see we've got the seven walls and so on, and the walls of the tomb are 8 by 5, which is the golden mean, and there's just so many other interesting things about it, because in 1614 the first of 3 manifestos was published, apparently written by a Lutheran pastor, Valentin Andrea, which revealed a renewed occult philosophy that drew together strands of Renaissance, Hermetic, Kabbalistic tradition with the later modern scientific approach espoused by Francis Bacon. Now here, this is another Rosicrucian drawing. I use the word loosely. Rosicrucians weren't a brotherhood of mystical monks or anything like that. It was a loose term for a way of looking at the world, which was actually, according to Dame Frances Yates, who's died now, and her researches, founded on the works of Francis Bacon. That this came after, but was building on his idea. And this is the so-called invisible college. It's not very invisible, but if you decode it, it's full of symbols, absolutely full of symbols. The whole thing is it's movable. That's what I mean by invisible. It's not locked. It's fluid. It's moving about. It's supported by God. God is holding it up because it's God that they're interested in. And there's just so many other symbols that we could look into, which relate to this whole Rosicrucian phenomenon and the way they saw themselves, and it's all about knowledge and gaining knowledge. Well, this is the Atalanta Fugens by Michael Meyer, published 1617, so right at the time of this Rosicrucian appearance, presents alchemy as a symbol for a religious and intellectual movement that we could call Rosicrucian. And it was linking the people and geometry and other sort of Kabbalistic ideas all together. And there's loads and loads of these illustrations, woodcuts and engravings, which are full of symbols, and each one of them, you could do a lecture on and how it fits in, but it just gives you an idea of the thinking. At the heart of this movement and philosophical approach was a quest to bring about personal enlightenment, scientific discovery, and social reform, leading ultimately to the resurrection of a golden age. This very much echoes Bacon, who in his great Instauration, published 1620, states his desire for a general and universal reformation of the whole world, a renewal of all arts and sciences. So they're all singing from the same hymn sheet, okay? Despite often quite major differences in approach, because they didn't all agree with each other, all the intellectuals of whatever discipline or expertise, whether it's chemistry, physics, philosophy, medicine, they all seem to have been engaged in this one quest of a better world through knowledge and personal enlightenment. The two had to go hand in hand. And the whole concept of alchemy is really based on the individual going through a journey and then the discovery of knowledge, and then using that knowledge to help reform society. Which, if we look at the backcloth, as we were saying earlier, the last thing most of the powerful people in the time wanted any form of social reform, because they were doing very nicely out of it. So you can imagine that all this had to be done in a very, very covert and sophisticated way, where if someone saw something like this, who was on the opposition side, wouldn't be able to say, well, that's heretical. So they were very clever in the way that they used symbols, understood by themselves, but able to be sort of cast off as quite innocent if they were challenged. However, fundamental to this profound social reformation was the acquisition of scientific and philosophical knowledge. To the God-fearing, and I use the word God-fearing as opposed to Christian, God-fearing educated elite of the 17th century, all knowledge had a divine essence emanating from the mind of God. To access this knowledge, there was the modern scientific approach, advocated by Bacon and continued by Robert Boyle, Isaac Newton and many others, but there was also another route to enlightenment, and this was the art of memory. By the 17th century, the art of memory had evolved from elaborate systems developed by the ancient Greeks for remembering long speeches and sagas to a more sophisticated concept. The excommunicated Dominican friar Giordano Bruno, who I mentioned before, burnt at the stake for heresy in 1600, had published The Shadow of Ideas 8 years earlier, so it's in 1592, in which he claimed that the art of memory was a hermetic secret. Bruno, we know, was well known to Poussin's intellectual circles. It is therefore inconceivable that Poussin had not come across the art of memory. But what exactly do we mean by this art of memory? During the Renaissance, memory itself had become an extension of the soul, and thus immortal. Augustine believed that memory, understanding and will were the three powers of the soul, the trinity of man. The logical extrapolation of this position is that although the body will inevitably die, the soul, and hence memory, lives on. Furthermore, if the memory is divine, conferred on man by God, then it must contain divine knowledge and wisdom. It is this aspect of memory that was to coalesce in the writings of Dee, Bacon, Bruno, Camillo and Campanella, all of whom were to influence the thinking of Poussin and his circles. And the people I mentioned there, most of those wrote their own form of utopia. So they're all on the same quest. Francis Yates sums up Bruno's position thus: the aim of the memory system is to establish within, in the psyche, the return of the intellect to unity through organisation of significant images. So that's quite important when we're talking about artists and imagery. Gradually moving from a belief in magico-alchemical knowledge, by the mid-1600s, the secrets held by the memory were considered to be those of spiritual and scientific understanding, the essence of personal and social reform. Foremost in this evolution from magic to science, in true Baconian fashion, was the eminent mathematician and philosopher René Descartes, who I've already mentioned. Imagery and symbolism were the keys to unlocking the memory, and who better to represent these than an artist? I suggest that Poussin was one such artist. His paintings were never intended as commentaries, but as stimuli to access the depths of divine memory. The role of Les Bergers d'Arcadie, that's the Arcadian Shepherds, which I showed you before, in this context is summed up by Martha Graham in her Memoirs of the Life of Nicolas Poussin, 1820. Quote, "And there was never more moral tale or fable that spoke more to the mind than this picture of the Arcadian Shepherds." Now, I feel this quotation captures the true essence of the Arcadian Shepherds. In this painting, more than all the others, it appears Poussin has succeeded in drawing the viewer into the canvas in the expectation of unlocking the divine memory held deep in the subconscious. There is, however, another important element to the art of memory. Theatre can be considered both as a technique within the art of memory as well as the aim of it. In the late 16th century, the concepts of theatre and memory were inextricably linked to Kabbalistic philosophy. Guido Camilero's famous memory theatre proposed to show how man, the great miracle, could harness the powers of the cosmos with magia and Kabbalah, as described in Pico's oration on the dignity of man, might develop magical powers as an orator by speaking from a memory organically affiliated to the proportions of the world harmony. Now that sounds like gobbledygook, and I haven't got sufficient time to really sort of analyse it, but what he's saying really is that we've all got in us this divine memory, and if you choose the right symbols and the right sort of structure, you can unlock this memory, because the memory is within you, and it's just a case of getting it out. But it needs tools to do that. And I believe that the often misrepresented science or discipline of alchemy was all about unlocking this potential. It wasn't anything about turning lumps of lead into bits of gold and flogging it on the gold exchange. It was all about taking this rough, untutored human and bringing forth the divine knowledge that we have inside us. Bruno attempted to build on Camillo's concept of the memory theatre as a device through which the mysteries of religion and the universe could be grasped. In the course of his studies, Bruno met up with many of the most important thinkers of his time, such as Sir Philip Sidney, John Dee, Francis Bacon and William Shakespeare. His ideas gained popularity with other European intellectuals. Bruno came to London and he met with these people. So they're all sharing in this same idea. And isn't it interesting how theatre is such a strong part of all these studies? And we're not just talking about Shakespeare and the Globe, we're talking about these huge, lavish entertainments that were put on for courtiers and so on, which were full of symbolism. And I think my view is they were billed as entertainments, but I think they were used also very cleverly with the mythological connections and the symbolism, animals that were chosen and so on, to convey messages which other people could see. But of course, you know, the less educated courtiers just, you know, had a good time. She links that previous one, I'm running a bit out of time, to this geometry. What's particularly interesting is, look what we've got here. Most unusual. Joy Hancock came across this collection, or sent a collection of geometrical drawings which had been collected by Barham. I don't have all the details here, because exactly what dates, but they cover quite a period of time, and there's quite a lot of them. And some of them have been seen to be ground plans for the theatres, or she thinks they are. But the trouble is, there's very little notation with any of them. Some have got some names on them. In my book, I do go into a little bit more of the connections which are relevant to my work. But this particular one, this is meant to be the theatre of the world. And again, if you've got time to dissect all the symbolism, then it's representing the theatre again as a model for the world. And then she links, I haven't done this, she links that particular painting, engraving to this. Now, I haven't gone into great detail. What she has to say is very interesting, and it's a whole study on its own, to be quite honest. And I think it's still ongoing. I have corresponded with her.
A bit like the crop circles.
Yes, yeah. Well, I suppose crop circles are geometric because that's the easiest way to create them, really, I suppose.
But like you were saying earlier about the ratio of the Greek buildings,
yeah.
I think what Joy is saying is these ratios are meant to, you're not just watching theatre. If you were watching the theatre in the right structure, which is with these ratios, the whole experience would take you into another
absolutely
level.
Absolutely. Yeah, well, this is the Theatre of Life, published in 1596. The Theatre of Life is a collection of engravings and poems illustrating the metaphor of human life as being played out as if on a stage. Shakespeare's All the World's a Stage. Okay? Now, this is another Poussin's paintings. It's The Blind Orion. And again, it's a mythological theme of Orion, who's blinded, being led by, forgive me, because I don't remember all the different people. But an eminent art historian, Gombrich, he wrote a treatise on this, explaining it as the cycles of nature, and he talks about that being man walking through a natural environment. The clouds produce rain, and you've got the rain cycles. So I don't completely buy that, because I've got a different interpretation. I think that blind Orion represents humanity in a state of ignorance. So you've got this huge mass of humanity striding through nature, but not actually seeing anything and not knowing what's going on. That actually is the rising sun. The rising sun is a symbol of knowledge. And my personal interpretation of this is that this is a symbol of man, or mankind, striding through nature, ignorant, seeking the source of enlightenment. And to my mind, that fits in very much more with the rest of his philosophical paintings. Now, it is only speculation because we don't have any of his words to corroborate that. So, in conclusion, the central thesis of my book, which was focusing on this painting, is that Poussin discovered learned and employed sophisticated techniques in his paintings that will bring about a deep psychological effect on his viewers. Now, we do have a letter of his, and he writes to one of his patrons, saying, and I paraphrase, "These marvellous Greeks knew a thing or two. They've showed us the art of modes." Now, again, if you go into modes, you find these are used in music, and they refer to different scales. And the different scales bring about a different psychological effect on the listener. Poussin applied it to colour and form. And so the modes of painting, how you paint something, the colours you use, the combination of colours, and the way you present the characters will have an effect on the viewer. Well, you expect that because that's what you know. But it's not just, oh, isn't that pretty? It's an effect at a far deeper level than the viewer is actually aware of. By appealing to their senses and reason, and again, in a couple of his letters, writing to people he's sent paintings to, who've come back to him having received them with some sort of criticism, he says, "You've got to learn to read my paintings." Doesn't say look closely. He says you have to learn to read my paintings. You have to study them. So he knows that the real value of his paintings isn't just a glance in a library, in a museum or an art gallery. It's to engage yourself with it, to read it. So on both a conscious and subconscious level, I feel he hoped to awaken such a depth of feeling that the viewer could experience a sort of fantasy journey into a golden age, possibly reliving fleetingly the memory of a past golden age, assuming, of course, that we have this memory inside us of the past. So he's saying you can learn to recreate it yourself. We must also entertain the possibility that Poussin himself was undertaking such a journey during the execution of these works, that he was entering a golden age of his own imagination, but founded on the essential principles of the ancients. Now here, I think, what he's doing, because obviously these aren't actually put on the painting, but they're subliminally part of the composition, that the figure 7, this powerful symbolism of sort of universal knowledge, and the focus, because of the way that the whole composition is focusing in on this et in Arcadia ego, and in Arcadia I was once in Arcadia, I was once in the golden age. That's what he's trying to do with this painting, which is a visual means of the sort of philosophy and approach that Bacon and all these other people were actually writing about. This is a way of putting it into pictures, and we all know how powerful pictures are. Et in Arcadia ego is quite interesting because it's and in Arcadia I. It doesn't say I am, I was, or I will be, and I think deliberately so, because I think the whole philosophy is there was an Arcadia, I once was in Arcadia, I am in Arcadia if I was bright enough to realise it, because the planet is still fantastic, and I can be in Arcadia if only I can attain the knowledge. So, in a way, it makes sense that there's no verb because it applies timelessly, which brings us back to time bringing forth truth, doesn't it? So in time, we will get these truths. We had them, and we've got to refine them. This is just another example of one of Poussin's paintings. His concept of the perfect landscape. You see how perfect the architecture is, how perfect the landscapes are. Have any of you visited Starhead Gardens? in Wiltshire. Fantastic gardens. Have you been there? Fantastic, with little sort of imitation temples, just like this. It was perfect. And that was built at the time by, I don't know if it's Capability Brown or one of those, as the ideal world, because that's in the 17th century, 18th century, these people with masses of money, they were creating their own Arcadias in these wonderful country house gardens, and Stourhead is a particularly good example. They've nearly all got a lake in them. And just you can just imagine the shepherdesses and the shepherds living sort of a perfect life in these wonderful gardens. So that's one example of Poussin's paintings. And that's another one. They're very, very similar. Everything's perfect. And if you look at all the architecture, it's all classical. It's all Vitruvian, which is built on these principles of the golden mean and the other ratios. There's nothing unharmonious about it. It all flows and blends. And the people just quietly getting on with their daily lives.
Is that Poussin?
Yes, yeah. I'm sorry, I can't tell you which one. I very hastily put those last two in as an example.
You talked about the classic scene. It's a reminder of Parnassus, which is Delphi.
Yeah.
Of course, had all these temples and then the sacred mountain behind it.
Well, except I've been to Delphi, and it's very much more within the mountains. And this is quite an open landscape, isn't it? But I think they're idealised. I think they're a concept of what the perfect world could be. If only we could recreate it, and everyone sort of living happily and with lovely architecture and nature doing what it should do, and so on. As I was saying, we must entertain the possibility that Poussin himself was undertaking such a journey and was entering into this golden age of his own imagination, but founded on these essential principles of the ancients. That's getting everything right. This may well explain the following perceptive observation from Blunt, once again, concerning the Arcadian Shepherds, when he wrote that his determination to efface himself, because he was a very private man, and even though he was given the honour of the first painters of the King of France, Louis XIII, he lived a very austere and stoic life, and you saw by his self-portrait, he dressed in black. And there's quite, just inside, there's an interesting report of a meeting he had with one of the cardinals, and the cardinal come to visit him in his home and commented on how dingy it was, and he makes some comment about, well, it's all right for you with all your candles, burning day and night, as if to say, you live that way, I'm going to live my quiet life. And he didn't seek any sort of publicity or anything, just worked quietly. Hated doing these big frescoes and things. In fact, he didn't do, in the latter half of his life, he didn't do any of those. Did all these private paintings, all these philosophical meditations, I would call them, for a group of people who obviously shared his visions. But back to Blunt, his determination to efface himself and to seek nothing but the form perfectly appropriate to his theme led him to create paintings which, though impersonal, are also deeply emotional, and though rational in their principles, are most mystical in the impression they convey. And I think that sums them up. There's a mystical quality, and if you just look at them and gaze and let yourself go, you find yourself being drawn into it. And I think that's exactly what he was going to do. So basically, Poussin's Arcadian vision, search for the golden age, is really what I've talked about today, but in far more detail, crossing the T's and dotting the I's, and hopefully convincing you that that's what Poussin was doing, which was building on the work started it's in the late Renaissance, certainly taken up by Francis Bacon and massively given a kickstart forward, and then the modern, what we call modern scientists, people like Isaac Newton, Robert Boyle and so on, took up the mantle. Unfortunately, we seem to have gone backwards. The scientific discovery is fantastic today. We can't deny that. Medicine, science, space, fantastic, but we just completely messed up the planet, and we don't seem to know how to live with each other. So there's still a lot of work to be done. Thank you very much.
Yes, if you could go back to what was a primary picture of Shepherdess of Arcady in the first run of your pictures.
Okay.
Is it, I was struck by the continual centerpiece of a rock that looks like a castle, and in most of the paintings that he's done that you've shown us, there was that focal point of a rock that's shaped very much like a natural sort of bastion, a tower almost.
I think you'll find in his architecture, in a lot of cases, he tries to blend it in with nature, so it almost looks as though the architecture is part of nature. And I think that's the point he's trying to convey, that if you build things the right way, they become natural. Whereas if you build it in the wrong proportions, it stands out. Now, I don't think that this is, if you look at it carefully, it is just a top of a mountain. And it is, to, in my view, to represent the landscape of Arcadia, which was this mountainous landscape. There are other people, especially in the Rennes group mystery, who believe that this is Bougarache and this is Rennes-le-Château and Blanchefort and various other mountains. But quite frankly, unless Poussin was here to tell me himself, I'm not going to believe it.
Yeah, but the theme that struck me is these almost pillars, which is Kabbalistic in a way, and one is in Jerusalem, for example, there are two mountain tops or hill tops. One is Moriah, a place of sacrifice, and the other Zion, a place of elation or divine knowledge, if you like. And these are still represented in imagery in most of his paintings that you've shown us.
To be quite honest, I can't comment because I don't know enough about that particular. What I have found, and I have to hold myself back, is from making assumptions. Because something is very similar to something else, it may well be symbolically what it intends, but it's very, very hard to pin these things down, you know.
Yeah, it's a pity to say assumption. They're more of a correspondence.
Well,
something which is older, deeper, and more, as it were, more ancient in knowledge. And it's the imagery that's portrayed here that strikes you straight away. I saw, I've seen this painting and representations of the painting quite a lot, and there's more and more being revealed in it every time we see it.
Yeah.
And according to your own tablet of knowledge, obviously, and over the years, like you mentioned at the beginning of your lecture. So it's just that there are other things apart from the geometry to make up the composition. I was struck by the fact that the two who are alike here, even in their proportion of where their heads are, struck me as Castor and Pollux, which is the Gemini, the twins, who were always also the pillars, the twin tradition being right at the centre of this painting and at the allegories that have been portrayed. And then, of course, our man in the blue as the hunter himself, back to mankind, as you pointed out. It's just the enrichment of all these
highly possible.
colours. Well, I'd love to see the original colours because the painting that I last saw in the Louvre, it was very dull.
Absolutely.
It's not been cleaned or anything. I'd hand this on to anyone else. Do you want to make a point?
Yeah, I want to. Well, I was just going to say, could we go back to the, the picture where you've got your circle and
yeah, the geometry.
Mathematical. Your lines. It was your, and you've got the basic on
Yeah.
Because I always see this figure as the Madonna. And I've always thought the way she stands, and I know they're always voluptuous then, that I always think of her as pregnant. And then when you've put that circle there, and right in the middle, I don't know, and you're saying about the twin tradition, that's where that always takes me. So, like you were saying, there's so many different ways of looking at this, but to me, she's always been the one that stood out. She's taller than the other figures. It's the feminine essence.
And knowledge and wisdom.
Sophia. Absolutely.
Or in Greek or Roman mythology, the equivalent. It's all the same.
Absolutely.
What's interesting, again, I haven't included it in this talk because I haven't got time, but I look into this figure and how it relates to Arcadia, and there are just too many correspondence for it not to be right, to be honest. And then you mentioned Castor and Pollux. Well, there's also the whole Arcadian theme is built on the Great Bear and so on. Again, that's a whole lecture in itself. So, I'm not discounting anything. And their minds were full of these astrological, astronomical and mythological connections.
Also, just on the same theme, I noticed, like Rennes Chateau, the area in the country was called Septa Magna, 7 hands, and it was the place of preferred election for all the officers of the retired Roman legions.
That's right.
It was their pensionable Arcadia. Which is very
Mind you, it's a lovely area with great wine.
I was going to say one other thing. You mentioned about you mentioned Joy Hancock, and of course Tintern, where the Invisible College was meant to have been. The Lorraines were involved in looking after St Michael's Church for quite a time. So that's why I've always thought there's a connection between Rennes and Tintern and Bacon and other people in Europe, sort of. And Dee. And just one last point. Sorry, lots of these thoughts coming. Can you show? The picture you had of Bacon's pan on? It was on the front of one of his books.
Saving Truth.
And again, you had it. It was a circle. It was in. Maybe I'm just reading things into it, but I thought it was interesting how you've created the circle on the Poussin's painting, and then that diagonal line, and here you have it too with Pan. And if you put in your what's the 5-sided?
No, 7-sided. Mine's a heptagon.
Heptagon. Yeah. In here, I wonder whether that Pan's stance would. It was almost in the same.
Well, what I don't know is offhand who did this engraving. Now he's obviously chosen it. He might have commissioned it. I don't know, or it was already there and he's used it, or the publisher has put it in. Without knowing these details, one can't then draw too many conclusions. Of course. But there's probably lots of symbolism in that, other than just the figures.
Absolutely.
If you know what you're looking for. I'm not an expert on symbology. That's again a whole field which probably years of study.
Can you blow that one up again a bit?
Yes, I'm sorry they're not terribly good images, but it's not easy to get hold of these.
Oh, right.
You see, his staff was going through
this
almost
one,
the same diagonal as in. This is the same angle. Yeah, exactly the same angle. That's why I just thought, oh gosh, that's fascinating. But also, I was just going to say, you're talking about Shakespeare, and of course with Midsummer Night's Dream and many of these plays, again, it's a throwback to Arcadia and Edmund Spenser, the Fairy Queen, and the whole mythology of Elizabeth and being seen as this Fairy Queen.
Yes. There is in the banner. Now, in the banner, it has the verb patet, which is not saving. This is time not saving itself. It's another word. Taking truth from the hidden. And the patet is more or less inaugurating, inaugmento, rather than saving. It's just an interesting saving truth.
So Guy, thank you very much. That was a brilliant talk, and for me, you made. Sorry, come stand with me. You made some quite complex theories understandable, and it takes a great gift to do that. So I can see you were a very good teacher.
Thank you very much.
And the other thing, I actually feel very happy and uplifted. And sometimes at the end of quite important esoteric or academic talks, I feel the reverse. So I think you've done what Poussin did, and you've left us, there's a deeper effect here in the talk you've given. So thank you from everybody.
Thank you.